President Biden is facing backlash from conservatives online after he hosted transgender activists at the White House for an interview. Let's watch some of that.
It feels like Republicans have turned trans and non-binary people into this thing to blame society's downfall on in some ways. And this narrative is not only dangerous to our mental health, but also our physical safety. And particularly trans women of color are being murdered at an alarming rate.
More than any other group of people.
Thank you. How can Democratic leaders be more effective in advocating for us trans people and our families and our lives and our opportunities?
I'm not being facetious when I say this, being seen with people like you. No, I mean it. I genuinely mean it. People fear what they don't know. They fear what they don't know. And when people realize, individuals realize, oh, this is what they're telling me to be frightened of, the trans part's not immoral. What they're trying to do to trans persons is immoral.
The president also ruffled some feathers by confirming his commitment to gender-affirming care.
Do you think states should have a right to ban gender-affirming health care?
I don't think any state or anybody should have the right to do that. As a moral question and as a legal question. I just think it's wrong.
So I don't know, what do you make of this, Robby?
Well, look, I do take issue with what this individual said in the first clip. Yes, it's true that there have been a number of deaths, of killings in that specific demographic, trans women of color. It is not, however, because of anti-trans bigotry. They're not victims of anti-trans hate crimes. We're talking about people who are in very dangerous, at-risk situations in terms of like drug dealing and prostitution, and these are very tragic deaths, and fine to discuss policy interventions to protect them, but it is not transphobic people are killing them because they're trans. It's just not true.
Isn't that part of the argument that the whole point of having various marginalized identities, being poor, being more likely to be poor because you are disproportionately kicked out of the house at a young age, are experiencing homelessness at a higher rate, are therefore turning to certain kinds of jobs that are more dangerous, like sex work, etc. All of those things coming together are part of the experience, right? I don't know how much you can disaggregate them, but if the point is that we're in agreement that this population is uniquely vulnerable for whatever reason, I don't really care if trans women are dying because someone who has a t-shirt that says "I hate trans people" is going around on a vendetta versus being in situations that put them higher at risk. The point is that you don't want people to be dying.
I mean, I support legalizing both sex work and drugs, so sure, I support policy interventions that I think would address this, but,
so I guess
but it's not, there's no trans, I wouldn't put a trans, there's no reason to put a trans framing on it.
My critique of this would be, if anything, that there is a little dissonance for me seeing, and again, I don't know this woman's background, but seeing someone who is not a trans woman of color.
She recently she has a TikTok account or something like that, social media account. Yes, where it's a day whatever of being a girl, day 70 of being a girl.
I've seen the coverage of that. So again, these are choices that I find to be incongruent. Why have this person who, frankly, is not a trans woman of color, is not from that kind of a marginalized space that she's speaking to, who has, herself attracted, is not going to be the most sympathetic person, rightly or wrongly, to a broader right audience, and who also isn't talking about the material issues that are affecting trans women of color. I would have loved to have seen a roundtable with trans women who were talking about poverty, who are talking about homelessness, who are talking about the renters crisis. A lot of issues that, frankly, Joe Biden has been insufficiently responsive to, and which are disproportionately problems for the trans community, but which are problems much more broadly. Why not talk about why haven't you, offered any kind of plan or solution to incredibly high healthcare rates, since that's something that is affecting people's access to gender-affirming care, instead of just sitting here talking in the abstract about how rich trans people who can afford these kinds of interventions can have access to them.
Right. As for the banning gender-affirming care, look, I don't really want to involve legislatures or governments in these kinds of things. If you're above the age of consent and if you're above the age of consent, whatever, you can have, if a doctor is willing to do it and you are an adult, that's your business. The dispute is over people who are underage, people who are children. And particularly probably in a case where a family is not as on board with it. Again, if the kid really wants it, family really wants it, doctor wants to do it, maybe I don't approve, but you know what, it's just not my business at the end of the day. People should do more looking out for their own families and their own children, minding more of their own business, I think. That said, I do see the kind of it's much more unsettled. The science behind a lot of all of this is, I think, more unsettled than activists on behalf of these issues concede. That we don't have long-term data on what happens if you socially transition when you're very young or pre-puberty, and then you take hormone blockers, and then you have everything else, and you know, how does it turn out for you? Again, I'm sure this is a good positive step for some people. Is this the normal experience for someone? Because it is a little bit of a cultural thing now to start identifying in a different gender, which I also don't care about. But there's that category of like people just messing with the concept of gender because that's like things young people do now.
Well, but
and
wait
then
a
actually
minute. We cannot say that. There is not, it's not a black box of we don't know what happens. People have been transitioning for decades, and I understand that there is, with greater social acceptance of trans people, more people who are going to be transitioning, and on the margin, some people who are going to come to detransition and make a different decision as they're older. But it is worth noting that the overwhelming majority of people who transition, who medically transition, do not detransition. And that the conversation about detransitioners, I really respect folks who brought it up, because everybody deserves to have their story told and be written about,
right.
But we shouldn't fall into the trap of overrepresenting.
But that's not the issue. The issue is that most people diagnosed with gender dysphoria do not ultimately transition and are glad that they did not. So the concern is pushing, because we're more widely diagnosing this or more widely discussing it, and the concern that people feel is if we push more of these people who are just being captured by this softer category of gender confusion into harder medical interventions, then you would have much more significant regret.
But then you have to prove that that is happening, and what you just described was an existent reality in which people are increasingly accepted and diagnosed in this way, but aren't there's not concurrent evidence that people are also detransitioning at a higher rate, and that they are being quote unquote pushed into medical interventions that are premature and irreversible.
Well, then we're not disagreeing. We shouldn't.
So yeah, I want to make sure that we don't frame it in a way that presumes that there's a problem here that needs to be demonstrated by the folks who, again, are trying to have legal bans on people living their life the way that they want to live, and that's the issue here.
Well, I don't support legal bans. There is the greater diagnosis of the sort of the gender dysphoria category, and I think it's perfectly fine, perfectly reasonable for there to be a lot of conversations between families, children, and doctors, and then, you know what, it's your business, not mine, and that's fine, and I don't want to involve the government. We should just be a little cautious about how we proceed, because some people do regret it, and my sense was if they would be more aggressively pushed, there'd be more regret on the other side.
Well, the we again is family. So we don't need to do anything but make sure that people have the right to live their life the way they want without the kind of bans that Republicans are advocating for across the country. But we'll have more Rising for you right after this.